Nuclear power was very popular in the 1960s and 70s. But after the near disaster at 3 Mile Island and the complete disaster at Chernobyl, global interest in nuclear energy soured. From then on, the United States leaned even more heavily on fossil fuels, further exacerbating climate change. But what if the United States was powered entirely by nuclear energy today? Hello, and welcome to What If Geography, where we try and answer the great geographic what if questions of the world. I'm your host, Jeff Gibson, and today we're going nuclear. No, not that. Nuclear energy. Not all that long ago, nuclear power plants were opening up all across the United States, promising to bring with them a nearly unlimited source of clean energy, aside from that pesky waste byproduct that is. That future ultimately didn't pan out, and nuclear energy has become somewhat of a pariah of the energy world today. So what happened? The discovery of nuclear fission in 1938 opened up two distinct possibilities for the United States and the world. On one end, nuclear fission brought about terribly destructive weapons that continue to risk the end of all life on this planet. But on the other end, it revealed an entirely new method of energy production that could power hundreds of thousands of homes without all that nasty air pollution caused by burning fossil fuels. Because it was relatively light in terms of pollution, nuclear energy rapidly became a significant contributor of power for many industrialized countries in the late 1900s. Between 1950 and 1980, hundreds of nuclear power plants were built all around the world, increasing the global power capacity from less than 1 gigawatt in 1960 to over 100 gigawatts in the late 1970s. To put this in perspective, 1 gigawatt of power is enough to power about 750,000 homes. At 100 gigawatts, that's somewhere around 75 million homes and businesses powered entirely by nuclear energy. That's an incredible level of growth, particularly for something that is very complicated and expensive to build out. Nuclear energy, of course, was pushed to even further heights after the onset of the 1973 oil crisis. During this period of time, OPEC nations issued an oil embargo to much of the Western world for their part in supporting Israel during the Yom Kippur War. This caused the price of oil and gasoline to spike and, in many places, just simply run out. Because so much energy around the Western world was still powered by oil at the time, this served as a catalyst for the rapid expansion of nuclear reactors. France and Japan in particular leaned heavily into nuclear energy as an alternative to oil. By 2019, over 70% of France's power was generated by nuclear power. It's worth noting here that France has never had a major nuclear disaster. Now, despite being a relatively clean source of energy that could power millions of homes across the United States, nuclear power suffered from two very visible problems. The first is that production of nuclear energy creates a radioactive byproduct that is difficult to manage. Much of this waste needs to be treated and then stored underground for an incredibly long period of time. This makes determining the eventual future outcome of nuclear radioactive waste kind of hard to predict. After all, how can we determine whether radioactive waste will still be safely contained 1,000 years from now, let alone 1 million years? The second problem is that nuclear power is still, well, nuclear. And that comes with all the inherent explodey risks that you can possibly imagine. But you won't have to imagine it because it's happened before. On April 26, 1986, the Chernobyl nuclear reactor went into meltdown, spreading radiation across a huge area in Europe, and led to the full-on abandonment of the nearby city of Pripyat. This, combined with the near disaster at 3 Mile Island in the United States, led to an increasing anxiety around nuclear energy. And of course, the relatively recent Fukushima nuclear disaster in 2011 has certainly not encouraged additional investment in nuclear power in recent years. Despite these three highly visible and very scary disasters, nuclear power is actually statistically one of the safest methods of power generation. When factoring in excess deaths caused by air pollution, fossil fuel sources of energy are responsible for thousands of times more deaths than nuclear energy. Nuclear power is far more comparable to wind, hydro, and solar in terms of death than coal or oil. Today, the United States still generates plenty of energy using existing nuclear power plants. There are currently 93 active nuclear reactors that, as of 2016, generated approximately 19% of the US's total energy. Unfortunately, this has been trending downward over the last decade, with more plants being decommissioned than planned for future development. While it appears that there's a future where nuclear power is gone from the United States entirely, what we're going to explore in the remainder of this video is, what if the US was powered entirely by nuclear energy today? But before we go into that, if you're enjoying this video, now would be a great time to subscribe. More fun geography videos are just one click away. The US currently gets about 19% of its energy from nuclear power. This is distributed via 93 nuclear reactors at 55 nuclear power plants within 26 states. All told, nuclear energy generates approximately 95.5 gigawatts of power for the United States. Compared to all other forms of power generation in the US, nuclear power currently ranks third, behind coal and natural gas, but well above hydropower, solar, wind, and other renewables. Though the current amount of nuclear power generated within the US has stagnated since about the year 2000. Now, in order for nuclear power to generate enough electricity for the entire country, it would need to grow by about 500% of its current capacity, with all new power plants providing an average of just about 1 gigawatt of energy. This is not an impossibility, of course. Of all of the US's current nuclear power plants, over half of them currently generate more than 1 gigawatt of energy, with the highest being about 1.5 gigawatts. That's a lot of power from a single power plant, which is why nuclear power was partially so popular to begin with. Finally, in addition to adding more energy in total, the new power plants would need to be better dispersed throughout the country in order to distribute the power to every city and person. There are currently only 3 power plants in the western half of the contiguous United States, one in California, one in Arizona, and one in Washington state. And there are currently no nuclear power plants in Hawaii, Alaska, or Puerto Rico. Every other nuclear power plant is located in the eastern half of the country. Logistically, this kind of geographic distribution makes getting nuclear-produced energy from a plant in Illinois to California very challenging, as electricity is often lost during long transmissions. Building out this many nuclear power plants is certainly not an impossibility, but it would be very expensive. The average cost of building a nuclear power plant with about 1 gigawatt of energy ranges from about $6 billion to $9 billion. With the US needing to build about 400 nuclear power plants, this would cost somewhere between $2.4 trillion and $3.6 trillion. That's a lot of money. And there's one other pesky problem with growing nuclear energy to this level: nuclear waste. Nuclear waste is a problem for nuclear energy, but it's not as big of a problem as it's been made out to be. Radioactive waste generated by nuclear power plants can be roughly broken down into 3 categories. Low-level waste, which emits about 1% of the total radioactivity of nuclear waste; intermediate level waste, which emits about 4% of the total radioactivity; and high-level waste, which emits 95% of the total radioactivity. High-level waste is, of course, very bad and highly dangerous for humans. But high-level waste also makes up an incredibly small percentage of nuclear waste generated. Even intermediate level waste only makes up about 7% of nuclear waste generated. Low-level waste, the kind of waste that gets treated and generally decays into harmless materials in about 3 decades, makes up 90% of all nuclear waste by volume. Of course, it's also worth pointing out that nuclear power plants aren't just overflowing with nuclear waste that they must get rid of daily. It's quite the opposite. The amount of nuclear waste that's been generated in the United States since the 1960s could all fit within a standard American football field with a depth of about 30 feet. That's a very small amount of waste. If the United States was powered entirely by nuclear energy, the relative amount of nuclear waste generated would be a minor blip on the radar. Today, US nuclear power plants generate about 2,000 tons annually. If the US was powered entirely by nuclear energy, that amount increases to about 10,000 tons annually. It would take about 8 years to fill up another American football field with nuclear waste, and the US has a lot of space for more football fields. And while storing nuclear waste is generally unpopular with people, currently 34 states store nuclear waste in some capacity, which means chances are high that if you live in the United States, you live in a state that stores nuclear waste, but you likely never knew about it or felt any adverse effects from it. Nuclear waste has simply become a convenient boogeyman for nuclear naysayers, when the reality is that it's a complex byproduct of a power source that has some pretty dang good upsides. Today, most of the world still relies on fossil fuels such as coal, natural gas, and oil to power their countries. This has had devastating effects on the planet as a whole, as climate change has begun wreaking havoc on natural systems. The United States currently gets about 60% of its energy from fossil fuels and coal. This creates about 2,000 million metric tons of carbon dioxide a year just from the United States. By contrast, nuclear energy produces basically no emissions whatsoever in the production of energy. The only emissions it creates is during the physical construction of the power plant. On a per ton basis, nuclear energy actually creates less total emissions than hydropower, wind turbines, or solar energy on a per gigawatt basis, simply because you have less to build and manufacture overall. Right now, fully 25% of the United States emissions are generated by electricity production. If the US was powered entirely by nuclear energy, it would remove about 1,500 million metric tons of carbon dioxide and equivalent particulate from the country's annual emissions. To put this in perspective, all of Africa combined emits about 1,300 million metric tons of carbon dioxide annually. If the United States were able to remove that much carbon dioxide and equivalent emissions from its annual production, it would go a long way towards the overall carbon reduction that's needed for the world to stave off catastrophic climate change. Of course, the United States is never going to be entirely powered by nuclear energy. But nuclear energy does need to be rethought of as a piece to the climate change puzzle. Wind, solar, and other renewable sources of energy are certainly growing, but they're still decades away from being a dominant source of energy. Nuclear power, by contrast, can make a much bigger impact in a far shorter period of time. And right now, we need all the time we can get. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you did, please subscribe to my channel. You can do that here. And if you want to catch more of my videos, you can do that right here. Thanks for watching. See you next time.